Did you know the average person today spends over 3 hours a day on their phone? That's about 50 days a year just staring at a small glowing rectangle. Now imagine a time when that rectangle didn't exist. Imagine a world without electricity, without the internet, without a single screen to distract you. When the sun went down, the world went dark. When the work was done, the day was yours. What filled that time? What filled the silence? We think of the Middle Ages as a dark, brutal, and boring time, but people are still people. They needed to laugh. They needed to play. They needed to connect. How did they do it? Forget swiping and scrolling. Their entertainment was real. It was tangible. You could touch it, hear it, and feel it in a room full of people. They didn't just consume entertainment. They were often part of it. So what happens when you take away the screen? What's left? Number 19, what if your story was your only Netflix? Imagine a world without books for most people. No TV, no internet. What did you do after a long day? You listened. Storytelling wasn't just something people did. It was a cornerstone of society. In a cold, dark hall, with a fire crackling in the hearth, a storyteller was the most important person in the room. They were the keeper of history, the source of news, and the provider of escapism. A good story could make you forget you were hungry. It could make a long winter night feel shorter. And this wasn't just about fairy tales for children. These were epic sagas. Think of Beowulf. We read it today as a dense, difficult poem, but it wasn't meant to be read silently from a page. It was meant to be performed. A skilled Anglo-Saxon poet, known as a scop, would chant the story, often accompanied by a harp. They would use alliteration and rhythm, not just for artistic flair, but as a memory aid. They had to hold thousands of lines in their head. The performance in the Great Mead Hall, as described in the poem itself, was the main event. It was how a lord like Hrothgar entertained his warriors. The discovery of the Sutton Hoo ship burial in 1939, with its lavish treasures including a magnificent harp, gave us a real-world glimpse into the kind of society that listened to tales like Beowulf. These weren't just stories, they were cultural events that bound a community together. Later in the Middle Ages, you had professional storytellers called minstrels or troubadours. They traveled from town to town, castle to castle, carrying stories and songs. They were the living internet of their day. They'd perform long narrative poems known as romances full of knights, dragons, and damsels in distress. The tales of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, popularized by writers like Chrétien de Troyes in 12th century France, were spread this way. People would gather in the town square or a lord's hall to hear the latest installment, much like we wait for the next episode of a TV series. Even for ordinary people, storytelling was vital. Think of Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, written in the late 14th century. The entire premise is a group of pilgrims on their way to Canterbury, entertaining each other by telling stories. It gives us a brilliant cross-section of medieval society, from the noble knight to the bawdy miller. Each tale reflects the personality and social class of its teller. This wasn't just Chaucer's literary invention, it reflected a real-life practice. On a long journey or during a break from work, telling stories was how you passed the time and connected with the people around you. You didn't just consume the story, you were a potential creator of the next one. Your own life, your gossip, your experiences could become part of the shared narrative. It was interactive and communal. There was no passive consumption. We looked for the next big series to binge watch, often alone. They gathered together in the cold and the dark and built worlds with words. The experience was shared. The emotions in the room, the gasps at a monster's appearance, the laughter at a clever joke one, were real and collective. It was a fundamentally human way to connect, using the oldest technology we have, the human voice. But how much of what we know is just a fraction of what existed? How many epic poems as grand as Beowulf were never written down and are lost to time forever? Did the greatest stories of the age simply vanish on the breath of the last person who told them? And what crucial parts of the performance, the gestures, and the music are we missing when we just read the flat words on a page? Number 18, how do you gamble when all you have is bones? We think of gambling as a modern vice, with its glowing casinos and online betting apps. But the urge to test fate and risk it all is ancient. In the Middle Ages, without fancy equipment, people gambled with whatever was at hand. And often, that meant dice. But these weren't the perfect plastic cubes we know today. Medieval dice were often made from bone, horn, or ivory. They were lopsided and imperfect. This wasn't a bug, it was a feature. Each die had its own personality, its own lucky way of falling. A smart gambler knew their dice. The most popular dice game across all levels of society was called Hazard. Its origins are murky, with some claiming it was invented by knights during the Crusades around 1125, but its rules were complex and its potential for ruin was massive. It was a game of pure chance and bold betting. You can see its legacy today. The modern casino game of craps is a direct descendant of medieval Hazard. It was so widespread and so destructive that kings and the church constantly tried to ban it. King Richard I of England, on the Third Crusade, issued an edict forbidding anyone below the rank of knight from playing for money. The stakes were just too high. Knights and nobles could lose fortunes, estates, and even their armor on a few bad rolls. But it wasn't just for the rich. Soldiers in their barracks, peasants in the tavern, and merchants on the road all played. You didn't need a fancy board, just a flat surface and a set of dice. The church condemned it not just because of the financial ruin it caused, but because it was seen as an attempt to divine the future, a power that belonged to God alone. It was also associated with blasphemy, as frustrated losers would often curse loudly. The Parson's Tale in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales specifically warns against the evils of hazard, calling it the mother of lies. Beyond dice, people bet on everything imaginable. They bet on animal fights like cockfighting or bear baiting. They bet on wrestling matches and archery contests. Any competition could be turned into an opportunity to gamble. In a world where life was often precarious and controlled by forces beyond your understanding, weather, disease, the whims of a lord gambling offered a strange kind of control. For a brief moment, you were pitting your luck against fate itself. It was a thrilling, dangerous, and deeply human way to feel alive. The archaeological record is filled with these simple gaming pieces. Dice have been found in Viking graves, Roman forts, and medieval castles. They are a constant reminder that for thousands of years, people have been willing to risk what they have for a chance to get more. We haven't changed much. The technology is different, but the thrill of the roll is exactly the same. They use knuckle bones, we use digital random number generators, but the hope and the desperation are timeless. So here are the questions that remain. How many unwritten rules and regional variations of these games are lost forever? Were there legendary gamblers known across entire kingdoms whose names we'll never know? And given the imperfect nature of their dice, was there a whole secret world of cheating and sleight of hand that was considered part of the game itself? Number 17, could you dance all night without a DJ? Forget nightclubs and curated playlists. In the Middle Ages, music and dance were things you made, not things you consumed. If you wanted to dance, you needed live music, and if you couldn't afford a professional musician, you and your friends made the music yourselves. It was participatory, it was communal, and it was essential to life. Dancing was one of the few forms of entertainment that crossed all social classes. Peasants danced in the village green on holidays. Nobles danced in the great hall of their castle during feasts. Types of dances were different, but the fundamental joy was the same. One of the most common forms of dance was the carol. You've likely seen it depicted in movies. It was a circle or line dance where people held hands and sang. The dance leader would sing a verse, and the rest of the group would sing the chorus as they danced. It was simple, easy to learn, and incredibly social. It didn't require trained musicians, just willing voices. The 13th century manuscript Cantigas de Santa Maria, a collection of songs from the court of Alfonso X of Castile, contains many illustrations of people dancing the carol. For the nobility, dancing was more formal and complex. It was part of courtly life, a way to display grace, elegance, and social standing. Dances like the Estampi were popular. This was an instrumental piece with a series of repeated sections allowing for more intricate footwork. Knowing the latest dances was as important as knowing how to ride a horse or wield a sword. It was a key part of the social education of any young noble. A manuscript from around 1450, the Gresley manuscript, contains detailed dance music showing how seriously it was taken. The music itself was made with instruments that seem rustic to us now. The pipe and tabor was a common combination, where one musician would play a simple three-holed pipe with one hand and beat a small drum the tabor with the other. Lutes, fiddles, or viels, and harps were also common. These instruments were loud and rhythmic, perfect for driving a dance. For a peasant festival, the music might be rough and raucous. For a courtly ball, it would be more refined. But in both cases, it was live. You could feel the vibration of the drum. You could see the musician's fingers move. There was no separation between the performer and the audience. The church had a complicated relationship with dancing. On one hand, it was seen as a potential source of sin and lewd behavior. Moralists like the English writer John of Salisbury in the 12th century wrote about the dangers of dancing, linking it to lust and vanity. On the other hand, dancing was so ingrained in popular culture that it couldn't be stamped out. Sometimes it was even incorporated into religious festivals. The Dance of Death, or Danse Macabre, a popular artistic motif in the late Middle Ages, often depicted skeletons leading people from all walks of life, popes, kings, peasants seen in a final dance, a stark reminder of mortality. Dancing was a physical release, a social ritual, and a form of celebration. It was how communities marked the changing of the seasons, celebrated a wedding, or simply blew off steam after a hard week's work. It was entertainment that engaged the whole body and the whole community. It wasn't about watching professionals, it was about joining in. But what did these dances actually look like? While we have the music and some descriptions, the precise steps for most common folk dances are lost. Were there dance crazes that swept across Europe, like a medieval Macarena? And how much of our modern folk dancing is a true echo of the past? And how much is a romantic reinvention? Number 16, what did you make when you couldn't buy everything? In our world of mass production and two-day shipping, we've mostly lost the connection between making and using. If you need something, you buy it. In the Middle Ages, making things was not just a necessity, it was a form of entertainment and personal expression. For many people, especially women, craft was a way to fill the long hours, create beauty in a harsh world, and socialize. Embroidery is a perfect example. While men were away at war or working the fields, women of the noble classes would spend countless hours with a needle and thread. This wasn't just mending socks, this was high art. They created vast, intricate tapestries that told stories. The most famous example is the Bayeux Tapestry. Though technically an embroidery, this nearly 230-foot-long cloth depicts the events leading up to the Norman conquest of England in 1066. It was likely made by English women in the 1070s. It's a historical document, a work of art, and a staggering testament to the skill and patience of its creators. For the women working on it, it was a communal project, a place to talk, to share stories, and to create something lasting. But craft wasn't just for the rich. A peasant woman would spin wool into thread and weave it into cloth for her family's clothes. This was a vital chore, but it also had a social dimension. Women would often gather together to spin, using a simple drop spindle, turning a tedious task into a chance to chat and exchange news. The rhythm of the work was the backdrop to their social lives. Men had their crafts too. A farmer might spend the winter evenings carving a wooden spoon, a toy for his child, or a decorative detail on a piece of furniture. This wasn't a hobby in the modern sense, it was a practical skill, but it also allowed for creativity and pride. A well-carved object was a source of satisfaction. For a man living in a world where he had little control, shaping a piece of wood with his own hands was a small act of mastery. Archaeological finds from medieval cities like York and London have unearthed countless everyday objects, combs made of bone, leather shoes, wooden bowls, that show a surprising level of care and decoration. These weren't just functional. Their makers wanted them to be pleasing to look at. Another craft that doubled as a vital activity was brewing. In a time when water was often unsafe to drink, ale or beer was the staple beverage for everyone, including children. Most households, particularly in rural areas, brewed their own. The woman of the house, the alewife, was in charge of the process. It was a complex and time-consuming task, but a successful brew was a source of pride and a cornerstone of hospitality. A failed batch could be a minor disaster. This practical craft was central to the rhythm of domestic life. Making things connected you directly to the material world. You understood the properties of wood, the feel of wool, the smell of fermenting grain. It trained your hands and your eyes. It taught patience. This wasn't about artisanal goods or a lifestyle choice. It was just life. The satisfaction we get from a DIY project is a faint echo of a time when making was not a choice, but a fundamental part of being human. But what were the unwritten rules of these crafts, the little tricks of the trade passed down from mother to daughter or father to son that were never recorded? How many unique regional styles of carving or embroidery have vanished without a trace? And that was like, shining up and doing your thing, even doing your things. Like when I started number 15, was there a board game that conquered the world? Long before video games, long before Monopoly, there was chess. Of all the games played in the Middle Ages, chess was the undisputed king. It was a game of strategy, intellect, and war, all played out on a board of 64 squares. It wasn't just a way to pass the time, it was a reflection of the medieval world itself. The game we know as chess didn't just appear in Europe. It has a long and fascinating history. It originated in India around the 6th century as a game called Chaturanga. The name meant four divisions, representing the four divisions of the Indian army infantry, cavalry, elephants, and chariots. From India, it spread to Persia, where it became known as Shatranj. When the Arab world conquered Persia, they adopted the game with enthusiasm. It was through the Islamic world, particularly in Spain and Sicily, that chess entered Christian Europe around the 10th century. When it arrived in Europe, it was adapted to fit the medieval feudal structure. The pieces were transformed. The Persian vizier became the queen, a relatively weak piece at first, only able to move one square diagonally. The elephants became bishops, the chariots became rooks, or castles, the cavalry became knights. The infantry remained pawns. The game was a perfect metaphor for medieval warfare and society. The king was the most important piece, but also vulnerable. He depended on his queen, his nobles, bishops, and knights, his castles, and his common soldiers, pawns, for protection. Chess was primarily a game for the nobility and the clergy. It was seen as a worthy pastime for a knight, teaching strategy and foresight without the bloodshed of a real battle. Manuals on how to be a good knight, like the one written by Ramon Lull in the 13th century, often recommended chess as a valuable skill. It was a game of the mind, a way to sharpen one's intellect. Monks played it in their monasteries, sometimes even making their own intricate chess sets. The famous Lewis chessmen, a set of 93 exquisitely carved walrus ivory and whale-tooth chess pieces discovered on the Isle of Lewis in Scotland in 1831, are a stunning example. Dating from the 12th century, their detailed, mournful-looking figures give us a powerful connection to the people who once played with them. The rules were slightly different from the modern game. The queen was much weaker, and pawns could only move one square forward on their first move. This made the game much slower and more tactical. The lightning-fast openings we see today were impossible. A game could take many hours, or even days. It wasn't until the end of the 15th century, around 1475, that the rules changed, giving the queen her modern, powerful moves, and allowing pawns to move two squares on their first turn. This McQueen chess, as it was sometimes called, sped up the game dramatically and changed its strategy forever. Playing chess was a quiet, intense affair. It was a battle of wits, a one-on-one mental contest. In a world that was often loud, chaotic, and violent, the focused silence of a chess game was a unique form of entertainment. It offered a world you could control, where success depended on your own intelligence, not on birth or brute force. But how did the common person who couldn't play chess view this elite game? Is it seen as a symbol of aristocratic power and leisure? How did the rules of the game first spread across Europe without printing presses or the internet? And were there legendary, unofficial grandmasters of the slow medieval game whose names are now completely forgotten? Number 14, how did you exercise when there were no gyms? In the Middle Ages, physical activity wasn't about working out. It was woven into the fabric of daily life. For a peasant, life itself was a workout. Plowing a field, scything hay, or carrying water was back-breaking labor. But for the nobility, physical prowess was not just a side effect of work, it was a cultivated skill essential for their role in society as warriors. Their entertainment often looked a lot like military training. The ultimate medieval sport was the tournament. In the early Middle Ages, this was not the stylized jousting we see in movies. It was a massive, chaotic mock battle called a melee. Two teams of knights would fight across a wide area of countryside, sometimes for a whole day. The goal was to capture opponents and hold them for ransom. It was incredibly dangerous. Knights were regularly injured or killed. The church condemned it for its violence and vanity. But it was also wildly popular. It was a chance for a knight to win fame, fortune, and the admiration of ladies. The English knight William Marshall, who lived from 1147 to 1219, rose from a minor noble to one of the most powerful men in England, largely on the strength of his success in tournaments. His biography tells of his many victories and the wealth he acquired from ransoms. By the late Middle Ages, the tournament had become more regulated and theatrical. The individual joust, where two knights on horseback charged at each other with lances, became the main event. Special armor was developed for jousting that was heavier and less flexible than battlefield armor, designed to protect against the specific impact of a lance. The goal was usually to break your lance on your opponent's shield or to unhorse him. It was still dangerous, but it was more of a sport and a spectacle. It was the medieval equivalent of Formula One racing, a display of skill, courage, and very expensive equipment. But what about less deadly sports? Archery was hugely important, especially in England. After the English longbowmen proved so devastatingly effective against French knights at battles like Crécy 1346 and Agincourt 1415, the English crown made archery practice compulsory for all able-bodied men. Laws were passed ordering men to practice with the longbow on Sundays and holidays. Archery contests were a common feature of village fairs. This was both a form of entertainment and a matter of national security. And wrestling was another sport, popular with all classes. It was a simple, raw test of strength and skill. Monks wrestled, peasants wrestled, knights wrestled as part of their training. The illustrations in medieval manuscripts show men grappling in a variety of holds. It was a way to settle disputes, show off, and have fun. Other rough-and-tumble sports included a very violent early form of football, sometimes called mob football. Entire villages would compete against each other, trying to move an inflated pig's bladder to a goal. The rules were few, and injuries were common. It was more like a controlled riot than a modern sport. These activities were not about health and wellness. They were about practical skills, social status, and raw physical competition. They were entertainment that tested the limits of the body and built the strength needed to survive in a violent world. But how did they treat sports injuries without modern medicine? Was there a folk sports medicine of herbal remedies and bone setting? How were the rules of a game like mob football communicated and enforced when hundreds of people were playing at once? And did women have their own less documented physical games and sports? Number 13, what? Was the point of a garden you couldn't eat? When we think of medieval life, we often picture mud and grime, but for those who could afford it, there was a deep appreciation for beauty, nature, and quiet contemplation. The medieval garden was not just a place to grow vegetables. It was a private sanctuary, a piece of paradise on earth, and a unique form of screen-free entertainment for the senses. There were two main types of gardens for the wealthy, the herb garden and the pleasure garden. The herb garden, usually found in monasteries, was practical. Monks were the doctors of the age and their gardens were their pharmacies. They grew plants like lavender, rosemary, chamomile, and sage for their medicinal properties. The rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, stipulated that monasteries should be self-sufficient, and this included growing their own medicine. But even these practical gardens were laid out in orderly, beautiful patterns, often in raised beds, making them pleasant places to walk and work. The real entertainment was found in the aristocratic pleasure garden. This was often an enclosed space, a hortus conclusus, or enclosed garden, walled off from the harsh outside world. This idea had deep symbolic roots, representing the Garden of Eden or the Virgin Mary's purity. But on a practical level, it was a private outdoor room. Inside these walls, you would find a carefully curated experience. There would be fruit trees for shade and scent like apple and pear. There would be flowers chosen for their color and fragrance such as roses, lilies, and violets. The famous 13th century poem Le Roman de la Rose, The Romance of the Rose, is an elaborate allegory that takes place entirely within such a garden, portraying it as a place of love and courtship. A key feature of these gardens was a turf bench. This was a raised bank of earth covered in tightly packed turf where people could sit. It was living furniture. There would often be a fountain or a small stream, providing the gentle sound of running water. This was a luxury, a symbol of wealth and engineering skill. The sound was meant to be soothing, masking the noises of the world outside, and encouraging quiet conversation or reflection. Birdsong was also a prized element. People would hang cages with songbirds in the garden to add to the natural symphony. Walking in the garden, sitting on a turf bench, listening to the water and the birds line. This was a form of medieval mindfulness. It was a way to engage the senses in a gentle, restorative way. For the ladies of the castle, the garden was one of the few places they could be outside in private, away from the noise and smell of the main hall. It was a space for reading, for embroidery, for talking with friends. It was entertainment that was slow, quiet, and deeply connected to the natural world. We seek out nature to unplug and de-stress. They built small, perfect versions of it right outside their doors to find a moment of peace in a chaotic world. It was a deliberate creation of a calm and beautiful environment, a screen for the soul. But how did they manage pest control without chemical pesticides? What lost knowledge of companion planting and natural remedies did medieval gardeners possess? Were there plant and flower varieties that were common then that are now extinct? And for the 99% of the population who didn't have a private pleasure garden, what was their relationship with the willed nature outside the village walls? Number 12. Could a holy journey be a vacation? The idea of traveling for pleasure is a modern one. In the Middle Ages, long-distance travel was difficult, dangerous, and expensive. Yet, millions of people undertook long journeys for a very specific reason, pilgrimage. On the surface, this was a purely religious act, a journey to a holy site to seek forgiveness for sins, to pray for a miracle, or to fulfill a vow. But, if you look closer, pilgrimage was also one of the great social and entertainment phenomena of the age. Imagine you are a peasant who has never traveled more than 10 miles from your village. Your life is a cycle of repetitive, hard labor. A pilgrimage was a chance to break free from that routine. It was an adventure. You would walk for weeks or months, seeing new landscapes, new towns, and new people. The journey itself was as important as the destination. Pilgrims often traveled in groups for safety, and this created a temporary, mobile community. You would walk with people from different social classes and different regions. You would share stories, songs, and food. This is the exact setting of Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales. A diverse group of people meet at an inn in London, all heading to the shrine of St. Thomas Becket in Canterbury. To pass the time on the road, they agree to a storytelling contest. This gives us a picture of pilgrimage not as a solemn, silent procession, but as a lively, social event. It was a break from the rigid social structures of home. On the road, a clever miller might get the better of a pompous reeve. It was a space of temporary freedom. The destinations themselves were awe-inspiring. Shrines like Santiago de Compostela in Spain, Rome, or Canterbury were the tourist hotspots of their day. The cathedrals that housed the holy relics were masterpieces of architecture designed to overwhelm the senses with their height, their light, and their beauty. For a peasant used to a simple wooden church, seeing a place like Canterbury Cathedral would have been a truly mind-blowing experience. The relics themselves, like a piece of the true cross, the bones of a saint, were housed in elaborate jewel-encrusted containers. Around these shrines, a whole tourist economy developed. There were inns and taverns to house the pilgrims. There were souvenir sellers peddling cheap metal badges called pilgrim badges. These were proof that you had completed your journey. Archaeologists have found thousands of these badges all over Europe, a testament to how widespread the practice was. The local community would put on festivals and plays to entertain the visiting pilgrims. It was a mix of deep piety and a carnival atmosphere. So, while the stated purpose was to save your soul, the experience was much more. It was a vacation from your ordinary life. It was a chance to see the world, meet new people, and experience things you could only dream of back in your village. It was entertainment on a grand, spiritual, and adventurous scale. It was a journey that changed you, both on the inside and the outside. But how many pilgrims who set out never returned, lost to disease, accident, or bandits on the road? What was the real economy of relics, and how many were fakes created to cash in on the pilgrim trade? And did some people go on pilgrimage simply as an excuse to escape a bad marriage or a life they hated with no intention of ever coming back? Number 11. Who needs a symphony when you have a lute? Music in the Middle Ages was not something you streamed from a cloud. It was something that happened in the room you were in. It was live, acoustic, and deeply personal. Whether it was a lone musician playing in a tavern or a group of performers in a royal court, music was an intimate and essential form of entertainment. The lute was one of the most popular instruments of the later Middle Ages, a pear-shaped stringed instrument. It was a descendant of the Arabic oud introduced to Europe through Spain. It was perfect for accompanying a singer or for playing complex solo pieces. A skilled lutenist was a highly valued entertainer. The sound is quiet and delicate, not meant for a large concert hall, but for a small room where listeners could gather close. It was the perfect instrument for love songs and courtly ballads, but music was everywhere, not just in noble courts. In the village, you would hear the sound of the bagpipes, a loud and raucous instrument perfect for festivals and outdoor dances. You would hear the rebec, a small shrill fiddle. You would hear the shawm, a loud double reed instrument that was the ancestor of the oboe. These were the instruments of the people, played by traveling musicians or talented locals. Singing was even more common. Everyone sang. They sang at work in the fields to keep a rhythm. They sang in church. The complex polyphony we associate with cathedrals was a specialized art form performed by trained choirs. They sang in the tavern after a few drinks. Folk songs told stories of love, tragedy, and daily life. These songs were passed down orally from generation to generation, constantly changing and evolving. We only know a fraction of them. The ones that were eventually written down centuries later, like Greensleeves, which, while often attributed to Henry VIII, likely has its roots in this older folk tradition. For the wealthy, music was a sign of a sophisticated education. A noble lady or lord was expected to be able to sing and play an instrument. Music was a key part of courtly entertainment. A great lord would employ his own musicians as part of his household. The 14th century French composer and poet Guillaume de Machaut worked for John, King of Bohemia, and created some of the most complex and beautiful music of the era. This was art music, created for a discerning audience. Listening to music was an active, focused experience. There were no distractions. You sat and you listened. You watched the musician's hands. You felt the rhythm. It was a shared experience that created a specific mood in the room. A sad song could bring a room to tears. A lively dance tune could get everyone's feet tapping. The musician was a kind of magician conjuring emotions out of thin air with strings and breath. We have access to all the music in the world, but we often hear it as background noise. For them, it was always in the foreground. But what did the music of the common folk actually sound like? The harmonies, the rhythms, the styles of singing are almost entirely lost to us as they were never written down. How did musicians learn their craft without formal schools, passing on complex techniques purely by watching and listening? And were there musical rivalries like medieval rap battles between competing minstrels in a town square? Number 10, was hunting really a sport? For a modern person, hunting is a controversial hobby. For a medieval peasant, it was a crime. But for a medieval nobleman, it was the ultimate passion, a complex ritual that was part sport, part military training, and part social spectacle. The forests of medieval Europe were not public parks. They were the private property of the king or the local lord. The animals within them, particularly deer and wild boar, were protected by harsh laws. A peasant caught poaching a deer from the lord's forest could be blinded, mutilated, or even executed. This is the background to the legends of Robin Hood, who famously hunted the king's deer in Sherwood Forest. He was a hero to the common people because he was breaking an unjust law. For the nobility, the hunt or the chase was a highly organized affair. It was far more than just going out and shooting an animal. It was a demonstration of power and skill. The most prized prey was the hart, a mature male red deer. The hunt followed a strict set of procedures. Specialized huntsmen would track the animal first, identifying the best one to pursue. Then the hunting party would set out, often with dozens of attendants, and a pack of carefully bred hounds. The chase could last for hours, covering many miles of difficult terrain. It was a supreme test of horsemanship and endurance. The hunt was also a social event. It was a way for a lord to entertain his guests. Ladies would often follow the hunt, watching from a safe distance. At the end of the day, there would be a great feast, where the captured animal would be the centerpiece of the meal. There was a whole vocabulary and etiquette associated with hunting. A complex series of horn calls were used to communicate across the forest. The process of butchering the animal, called the curie, was a formal ceremony, with specific parts of the animal rewarded to the hounds. The books were written on the subject, like the famous Livre de Chasse, Book of the Hunt, written by Gaston III, Count of Foix, in the late 14th century. It is filled with detailed advice and beautiful illustrations. Hunting a wild boar was even more dangerous. A cornered boar was a ferocious opponent, capable of killing hounds and even goring a knight's horse. The final kill was often done on foot with a spear, a true test of courage. This was seen as excellent practice for warfare. It taught a knight how to handle a weapon, how to control a horse at speed, and how to face a dangerous enemy without fear. Hunting wasn't just about the thrill of the chase, it was about mastery over nature. It was a ritual that reinforced the social order. The lord controlled the land, he controlled the animals, and he demonstrated his martial prowess for all to see. It was entertainment that was deeply tied to the concepts of power, status, and survival. But what was the ecological impact of this intensive, aristocratic hunting on animal populations? How did the poachers, the common people who hunted illegally to survive, view the elaborate rituals of the noble hunt? And were there secret hunting grounds known only to local peasants that the lords never found? On number 9, could your mind be your playground? In a world with far fewer external distractions, the internal world of the mind was a more frequently explored territory. For the small, literate elite of the Middle Ages, reading was a profound and treasured form of entertainment. But it was a very different experience from the way we read today. First, books were incredibly rare and precious objects. Before the invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century, every book was a manuscript copied by hand. The paper we used didn't become common in Europe until later in the period. Most books were written on parchment or vellum, which is made from processed animal skin. A single large book, like a Bible, could require the skins of over 100 sheep or calves. The ink was made from things like ground oak galls and carbon. The process was slow, laborious, and extremely expensive. A single book could cost as much as a small house. Because of this, books were owned by institutions, monasteries, universities, the very wealthy. A monastery library might have a few hundred books, which was considered a vast collection. Books were often chained to the shelves to prevent theft. For most people, the idea of personally owning a book was unthinkable. The act of reading itself was also different. We mostly read silently in our heads. In the Middle Ages, the common practice was to read aloud, even when you were alone. The words were seen as things that had sound and power. Reading was a vocal, physical act. The Latin word for reading, legere, is also connected to the idea of speaking. This practice of reading aloud made it a more immersive sensory experience. It also meant that one person with a book could entertain a whole room full of people who couldn't read. In a castle, a lady might read a romance aloud to her companions. In a monastery, a monk would read from the lives of the saints during meals. And what were they reading? The Bible was, of course, the most common book. But there was also a surprising variety of other texts. There were the lives of saints, which were full of dramatic stories of miracles and martyrdom. There were historical chronicles, there were books on science and medicine, often based on ancient Greek and Roman texts preserved by Arab scholars. And there was popular literature like the romances of King Arthur or the epic poem, The Song of Roland. These were the bestsellers of their day, copied and recopied for a hungry audience. For those who could read, a book was a portal to other worlds and other minds. It was a way to learn, to dream, and to escape the confines of their own lives. It was an intense and focused form of entertainment requiring silence and concentration. In a world of noise and community, the quiet solitude of reading was a rare and valuable pleasure. But what was the internal voice like for people who always read aloud? Did they even have one in the same way we do? How did the high cost and rarity of books shape which ideas survived and which were lost? And what popular trashy literature existed that was read to pieces and never considered important enough to be preserved in a monastery library? At number 8, how did you make a joke when the king could cut off your head? Laughter is a universal human need, but in the rigid hierarchical world of the Middle Ages, how did you make people laugh, especially the rich and powerful? You needed a specialist, you needed a jester or a court fool. The court jester is a familiar figure, often depicted in a brightly colored, mismatched costume with a floppy hat and bells. But they were much more than just clowns. A good jester was an intelligent, witty, and often highly skilled performer. They had to be able to sing, tell stories, juggle, perform acrobatics, and most importantly, make clever jokes. The jester occupied a unique and precarious position in the court. They were officially a servant, a member of the Lord's household. But they were granted a special kind of freedom, often called the fool's privilege. This was the freedom to speak truth to power. The jester could say things to the king or queen that no one else would dare to say. They could mock the nobles, criticize the king's decisions, and point out the absurdities of court life, all under the protection of humor. A famous fool named Triboulet, who served King Louis XII of France in the late 15th century, once complained to the king that a nobleman had threatened to beat him to death. The king said, If he does, I will have him beheaded 15 minutes after. Triboulet replied, well, I would be much obliged if you would have him beheaded 15 minutes before. This was a dangerous game. A joke that landed the wrong way could result in a beating or dismissal. The jester had to be a keen observer of human nature and a master of reading the room. They used puns, riddles, satire, and physical comedy to entertain the court during long feasts and evenings. They were a walking, talking form of social commentary. They reminded the powerful not to take themselves too seriously. In a world of rigid etiquette, the fool was the agent of chaos, the one person allowed to break the rules. But it wasn't just about telling jokes. Many jesters were also skilled musicians, poets, or acrobats. They were all-around entertainers. Some were natural fools, people with physical or mental disabilities who were kept for the amusement of the court, a practice that seems cruel to us today. But many others were licensed fools, sharp-witted professionals who chose the life of a jester as a career. Will Sommers, the jester of King Henry VIII, was known for his wit and was a trusted confidant of the king. He was one of the few people who could calm the king's infamous temper. The jester was the medieval equivalent of a stand-up comedian and a political satirist rolled into one. They provided laughter, which was a necessary release from the pressures of life. And they provided a sliver of free speech in a world where it barely existed. They were reminded that even the most powerful king is, in the end, just a man. But how was a professional jester trained? Was there an informal apprenticeship system? How many jesters misjudged their audience and paid a terrible price for a bad joke? And did they feel like they were truly free to speak their minds, or were they always walking a tightrope, terrified of falling? Number 7, could you be a star athlete without a team? Long before the Olympics were revived, people found ways to compete in individual tests of skill and strength. Falconry, or hawking, was one of the most prestigious and complex of these pursuits. It was known as the sport of kings, and was a passion for the nobility across Europe and the Middle East. This wasn't just about having a pet bird. Falconry was a deep art and a science. It involved a long and patient process of training a bird of prey, a falcon, a hawk, or an eagle to hunt in partnership with a human. The relationship between the falconer and the bird was one of mutual trust and respect, built over hundreds of hours. The bird was not a slave. It was a hunting partner that had to choose to return to the falconer after being released. The sport was a spectacle of natural athleticism. A peregrine falcon, the most prized bird, can dive at speeds of over 200 miles per hour. A falconer would release their bird to hunt other birds like herons or ducks. The skill of the falconer was in training the bird and in handling it correctly. The skill of the bird was in its incredible speed, agility, and eyesight. Watching a falcon hunt was like watching a top athlete perform. It was a display of raw, natural power guided by human intelligence. Falconry was steeped in status. The type of bird you could own was often determined by your rank. According to the Book of St. Albans, a book on hawking, hunting, and heraldry published in 1486, a king would fly a gyrfalcon, a knight would fly a peregrine, and a yeoman would fly a goshawk. A priest could only fly a lowly sparrowhawk. Your bird was a symbol of your place in the world. A well-trained falcon was an incredibly valuable gift, often exchanged between monarchs as a diplomatic gesture. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, who ruled in the 13th century, was a fanatical falconer, and scientifically observant book on the subject called De Arte Venandi cum Avibus, on the art of hunting with birds, which is still considered a classic text. The equipment was specialized and often beautifully made. There were leather gloves to protect the hand, hoods to keep the bird calm, and just as leather straps to secure it. The sport required deep knowledge of bird behavior, ecology, and veterinary care. It was a hobby that demanded patience, dedication, and a close connection with the natural world. It was a quiet, focused form of entertainment, often enjoyed in small groups out in the open countryside. It was you, your horse, and your bird against the wild. In an age of brute force, falconry was a sport of finesse. It was about partnership, not domination. It was a way to connect with the wildest aspects of nature, and for a moment to borrow its grace and lethality. But what secret techniques and training methods passed down from master to apprentice have been lost over time? How did falconers treat their birds' illnesses and injuries with the limited medicine available. And in a world without binoculars, how did they manage to track these incredibly fast birds across vast landscapes? Number 6, what was the original fast food joint? After a long day of work or during a festival, where did you go to relax, socialize, and get a drink? You went to the tavern. The medieval tavern or alehouse was the center of social life for the common person. It was the living room, the newsroom, and the entertainment hub of the community, all rolled into one. Taverns were everywhere. In a city like London in the 14th century, it's estimated there was one alehouse for every 12 people. They were easy to spot. Since most people couldn't read, they didn't have written signs. Instead, they had an ale stake, a long pole, often with a bush or garland on the end, sticking out from the front of the building. Inside, a tavern was probably a simple, noisy, and smoky place. The furniture would be basic rough wooden tables and benches. The drink of choice was ale. It was thick, nutritious, and, because the water wasn't always safe, it was a staple of the medieval diet. It was usually brewed by women, known as alewives, and the quality could vary wildly from one house to another. People didn't just go to the tavern to drink, though. They went to talk. It was where you heard the local gossip, the latest news from traveling merchants, or political rumors. It was the social network of its day, and it was a place for entertainment. You might find a traveling minstrel playing a fiddle in the corner. You might find a group of men in a heated game of dice or nine men's Morris. You could find storytellers, jugglers, and sometimes even prostitutes. The tavern was a place where the normal rules of society were a little more relaxed. People sang loud, bawdy songs. They argued, they fought. It was a lively, sometimes dangerous environment. The authorities and the church were often suspicious of taverns. They saw them as dens of sin, idleness, and potential rebellion. There were constant attempts to regulate them, setting closing times and trying to curb drunkenness and gambling. William Langland's 14th century poem Piers Plowman includes a vivid scene in an alehouse where a whole cast of characters gets drunk and neglects their religious duties. This reflects the common view of the tavern as a place that could lead good people astray. But for most people, the tavern was a vital escape. It was a warm, bright place in a world that was often cold and dark. It was a place of community in a life that could be isolating. It was where friendships were made, business deals were struck, and frustrations were aired. It was cheap, accessible, and offered a temporary respite from the hardships of medieval life. It wasn't always clean and it wasn't always safe, but it was real. But what were the unwritten rules of tavern etiquette? How did you order a drink or join a conversation? Were there brands of ale that were famous throughout a region, brewed by a particularly skilled alewife? And how many peasant uprisings or local rebellions were first planned over a pint of ale on a rough wooden table? Number 5, how did you watch a movie that was alive? Imagine a blockbuster movie, but instead of watching it on a screen, you watch it unfold in your town square. The actors are your neighbors, the baker, the blacksmith, the weaver. The story is one you know by heart, but you're seeing it in a whole new way. This was the experience of the medieval mystery play. Mystery plays, or miracle plays, were one of the most popular forms of public entertainment in the late Middle Ages. They were huge, ambitious, theatrical productions that dramatized stories from the Bible. They would tell the entire story of the Christian faith, from the creation of the world to the final judgment. A full cycle of plays could take several days to perform. These plays were not put on by professional actors. They were a community effort, organized and funded by the town's craft guilds. Each guild would be responsible for producing one play, or pageant. The shipwrights might produce the play about Noah's Ark. The bakers might do the Last Supper. The goldsmiths, fittingly, would take on the story of the three wise men. This was a source of great civic pride. The guilds would compete to see who could put on the most impressive show. The plays were performed on elaborate pageant wagons, which were like mobile stages. These wagons would be rolled through the streets of the town, stopping at several designated locations to perform. This meant that a huge number of people could see the plays throughout the day. The wagons themselves were often marvels of medieval stagecraft. They would have trapdoors for demons to appear from, hella space under the stage, and winches to lift angels up to heaven a second level on the wagon. They used special effects like fireworks to simulate the glory of God, or animal blood to make crucifixions look realistic. The plays were not dry, pious sermons. They were written to be entertaining. The writers added a lot of humor and everyday detail. In the plays from the Wakefield cycle, from the 15th century, the character of Noah's wife is portrayed as a comically stubborn woman who refuses to get on the ark. The shepherds in the Nativity story are portrayed as regular, grumpy English shepherds complaining about the weather and their masters. This mix of sacred story, slapstick comedy, and local color made the plays incredibly relatable to the audience. For most people who were illiterate and would never read the Bible for themselves, these plays were their primary source of religious education. But they were also just great entertainment. It was a huge festival, a day off from work, a chance to gather with your entire community and watch an epic story unfold. It was spectacular, emotional, funny, and sometimes scary. It was a shared cultural experience that bound the community together. The great cycles of plays, like those from York, Chester, and Wakefield, show a vibrant and creative theatrical tradition. But what was it like to act in one of these plays? Did the man who played Judas get heckled in the street for the rest of the year? How did they coordinate the movement of dozens of massive pageant wagons through the crowded streets of a medieval town? And, what director's notes or secret stage tricks were passed down within the guilds to make their show the best? Number 4, what did you play when you had no ball? We think of games as needing equipment, a ball, a board, a deck of cards. But one of the most ancient and widespread games in the world requires nothing more than a few stones and a pattern scratched in the dirt. This was Nine Men's Morris. Nine Men's Morris is a strategy game, a bit like a more complex version of tic-tac-toe. It's played on a grid of 3 concentric squares connected by lines. Each player has 9 pieces, or men. The goal is to get 3 of your pieces in a row, called a mill. And when you form a mill, you get to remove one of your opponent's pieces from the board. You win by reducing your opponent to only 2 pieces or by blocking them so they can't make a legal move. The game is incredibly old. Boards have been found carved into ancient Roman buildings, and a board was even found cut into a stone at the Kurna Temple in Egypt, dating back to around 1400 BC. But it was hugely popular in the Middle Ages. It was a game that anyone could play anywhere. Shepherds could scratch a board into a flat rock while watching their sheep. Monks could draw one on a slate in their cloister. You could even find a board carved into the stone seats in Canterbury Cathedral, likely made by the masons who built it or by board choir boys. In Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, Titania, the queen of the fairies, laments that the bad weather has flooded the fields. So, the Nine Men's Morris is filled up with mud. This shows that it was a common sight, a game played outdoors by ordinary people. The beauty of the game is its simplicity and its depth. The rules are easy to learn, but the strategy is complex. The game has 3 distinct phases. First, placing your pieces on the board. Second, moving them to adjacent points. And third, a special flying phase for a player who is down to only 3 men, where they can move to any empty point. This makes for a dynamic and challenging game. It was a game of pure skill. There was no luck, no dice. Your success depended entirely on your ability to outthink your opponent. It was a quiet, focused battle of wits. 2 people could sit for a long time, engrossed in a game, using pebbles or twigs as their pieces. It was a perfect way to pass the time on a long journey during a break from work or on a winter evening. Along with chess and backgammon, then known as tables, Nine Men's Morris was part of a trio of board games that were staples of medieval life. But while chess was often seen as a game for the nobility, and tables involved the luck of the dice, Nine Men's Morris was the great equalizer. It was a game for everyone. All you needed was a friend, a few markers, and a place to draw a board. It was entertainment in its purest, most accessible form. But what were the unwritten opening moves and strategies that a skilled medieval player would know? Were there regional variations in the rules that have since been lost? And how did a game with no central authority, no rule book, manage to stay so consistent across so many centuries and cultures? Number 3, did feast have a purpose beyond food? Eating is a necessity, but in the Middle Ages, feasting was a form of theater. For the nobility, a great feast was not just about serving a lot of food. It was a carefully orchestrated event designed to display wealth, power, and generosity. It was the ultimate form of social and sensory entertainment. A feast in the great hall of a castle was a multi-sensory experience. The hall would be decorated with rich tapestries. There would be a roaring fire. The air would be thick with the smell of roasting meat, spices, and wood smoke. The guests would be seated according to a strict hierarchy. The most important people sat at the high table, a raised platform at one end of the hall, with the lord and his family. The further you were from the high table, the lower your social status. The food itself was a spectacle. The sheer quantity was meant to impress. A single course could consist of dozens of different dishes. They ate meat of all kinds, beef, pork, venison, and a huge variety of birds, from chickens and geese to peacocks and swans. These birds were often cooked and then redressed in their own feathers to look as if they were still alive. There were elaborate sculptures made of sugar or pastry called subtleties, which would be brought out between courses. These might depict castles, mythological creatures, or scenes from history. But a feast was about more than just food. There was constant entertainment. A minstrel would be playing a lute or a harp. A jester would be telling jokes and performing tricks. Acrobats and jugglers might perform in the center of the hall. The feast was a long affair, lasting for many hours, with these performances woven in between the courses. The meal was the show. It was also intensely social. It was one of the few times the entire household, from the Lord's family to his knights and servants, would be together in one room. It was a time for the Lord to perform his role as a generous host and leader. Giving out food was a way of reinforcing loyalty. It was also a time for political maneuvering. Alliances were made, marriages were arranged, and deals were struck over a cup of wine at the high table. Even for peasants, a feast was a major event. It would happen on a major holiday, like Christmas or Easter, or to celebrate a wedding. A village feast would be a potluck affair, with everyone contributing what they could. There would be dancing, singing, and games. It was a rare and welcome break from the daily grind, a time of abundance in a life that was often marked by scarcity. It was a way to strengthen the bonds of the community. We eat for fuel, often quickly and alone. They feasted to build a society. It was entertainment that fed the body, delighted the senses, and reinforced the very structure of their world. But what did all this food actually taste like? How did they manage the complex logistics of preparing and serving hundreds of dishes without modern refrigeration or ovens? And in a world with no forks, what was the unwritten etiquette of eating with your hands and a knife at a crowded table? Number two, were the stars brighter back then? Imagine a night with no electric lights, no street lights, no house lights, no glowing screens. A night so dark that the only light comes from the moon and the stars. In the Middle Ages, the night sky was not just a dark ceiling. It was a vast, brilliant, and ever-present spectacle. Stargazing wasn't a niche hobby, it was an unavoidable part of life. Without the light pollution that blankets our modern world, the view of the night sky would have been breathtaking. The Milky Way would not have been a faint smudge, it would have been a brilliant shimmering river of light arching across the sky. People would have been able to see thousands of stars with the naked eye, far more than we can see from any city today. Constellations would have been sharp and clear, meteors, comets, and auroras would have been terrifyingly vivid events. The sky was their clock and their calendar. The position of the sun told them the time of day. The phases of the moon marked the passing of the month. The positions of the constellations marked the changing of the seasons, telling a farmer when to plant and when to harvest. The North Star, Polaris, was the constant guide for any traveler or sailor. This was practical, everyday knowledge. A 14th century manual for sailors would include star charts as essential tools for navigation. But the sky was also a source of wonder, mystery, and stories. The constellations were not just random patterns of dots, they were characters in the great myths. There was Orion the Hunter, with his belt and sword. There was Ursa Major, the Great Bear. People would lie on their backs on a clear night and tell these stories, passing them down through generations. The sky was the oldest storybook, and it was the domain of astrology. In the Middle Ages, there was no sharp distinction between astronomy, the scientific study of the stars, and astrology, the belief that the stars influence human affairs. It was widely believed that the positions of the planets at the moment of your birth determined your personality and your fate. And kings and queens would employ court astrologers to help them make important decisions, like when to go to war or who to marry. Doctors would consult star charts to determine the best time to perform a surgery or administer medicine. Reading the stars was seen as a way to understand the mind of God. Thinkers like Roger Bacon, a 13th century Franciscan friar and one of the earliest advocates for the scientific method, were also deep believers in astrology. For the average person, looking up at the night sky was a profound and humbling experience. It was a direct connection to the vastness of the universe and the power of God. It was entertainment that cost nothing, required no equipment, and was available to everyone. It sparked curiosity, inspired awe, and provided a sense of one's place in a grand cosmic order. We have to drive for hours to a dark sky park to get a glimpse of what they saw every single clear night. But how did they explain celestial events for which they had no scientific explanation, like a supernova or a solar eclipse? Was there a folk astronomy of the common people, with different constellation names and stories from the official ones? And in a world so deeply connected to the night sky, was the fear of the dark more or less intense than our own? Number one, what did you do when there was nothing to do? This is perhaps the most alien form of entertainment to a modern mind. In a world saturated with on-demand content and endless notifications, we have forgotten the art of doing nothing. For a person in the Middle Ages, moments of true quiet idleness were rare, but they existed. And in those moments, the entertainment was simply to be present, to sit, to think, to watch the world go by. Imagine a farmer at the end of a long day of plowing. He doesn't turn on the TV, he doesn't check his phone, he might just sit on a bench outside his small cottage and watch the sun go down. He would notice the color of the sky, he would hear the sounds of the village settling down for the night, a dog barking, a neighbor calling to their children. He would feel the evening chill. This wasn't boredom in our sense of the word. It was a state of being. This kind of quiet contemplation was also formalized in religious life. A central part of monasticism, as laid out in the Rule of St. Benedict, was prayer and contemplation. A monk would spend hours each day in silent thought meditating on scripture. This wasn't about being entertained, it was about training the mind to be still and to focus. But it was a way of occupying time without external input. For a layperson sitting quietly in a dark church looking at the flickering candles and the stained glass windows could be a similar experience. It was a way to step outside of the noise and worry of daily life and find a moment of peace. Even conversation was a different kind of entertainment. Without the ability to fact-check someone on Google in the middle of a story, conversation was less about information and more about connection. People would talk for hours. They would debate, tell tall tales, and share their thoughts. The philosopher Peter Abelard in 12th century Paris was famous for his public debates on theology and logic, which drew huge crowds of students. This was intellectual entertainment of the highest order, but on a simpler level, two friends talking by the fire was a primary way to pass an evening. The ability to simply be with your own thoughts was a skill. In a world with less information coming in, there was more space to process what was already there. Your memories, your plans, your worries, your dreams, this was the landscape of your mind, and you had plenty of time to explore it. This internal world was a source of entertainment, reflection, and creativity. We have come to see boredom as a problem to be solved, a void to be filled instantly with a new stimulus, and for them it was just a natural part of the rhythm of life. It was the empty space between the notes that allowed the music to be heard. It was in these quiet, unscheduled moments that ideas could form, that stories could be remembered, and that a person could simply feel what it was like to be alive. It was the ultimate screen-free activity, the simple, profound act of existing. But did they experience boredom as a negative emotion in the same way we do? Without constant distraction, were their inner lives richer and more imaginative than ours, or just filled with the same mundane worries? And if we were suddenly stripped of all our screens, how long would it take for us to relearn the forgotten skill of doing nothing at all?